Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and for those of you that are a fan on the chess group on Facebook, we recently asked who your favorite chess player of all time is, and Bobby Fischer won by a slim margin over Garry Kasparov. So I did want to make a video on a game that Bobby Fischer played, but I wanted to choose one that not many people are familiar with. I know most avid chess players have probably seen some of the most famous Bobby Fischer games that he played, whether that was the game of the century or against Spassky in the World Championships. But he did play a lot of other phenomenal games, and so that's kind of what I wanted to go over in this video. One of his many famous games that he played that just shows what a great chess player he is. This game was played between Fischer and Panno. Panno is a very strong GM. He was from Argentina. He was also a world junior chess champion, so a very strong player in his own right. Obviously against Bobby Fischer, one of the greatest chess players of all time. Not quite that strong, but definitely a very formidable opponent for Bobby Fischer to play at this time. So we'll go ahead and get into it. Bobby Fischer is playing the white pieces. Starts out with pawn to e4, and Panno responded with pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense. Bobby Fischer decided to play knight to f3, and after pawn to e6, Bobby Fischer elects to play pawn to d3. This is the King's Indian attack. This is one of the many different openings that Bobby Fischer was very familiar with and very strong in. He really understood a lot of the tactical and reasoning behind many of the lines that are commonplace today. He kind of developed him on his own. King's Indian attack being one of those. He's very strong in his own right. So we'll go ahead and continue. Black now plays knight to c6, simple development move, trying to get his knight into the action at the same time, trying to really hone down on these dark squares, on this d4 and this e5 square right here. Bobby Fischer continued with pawn to g3, getting ready to fianchetto his bishop to the king side, and Black decides to do the same thing with pawn to g6. Now Bobby Fischer plays with his bishop fianchettoing to g2, and Black does as well, bringing his bishop to g7. For those of you that are familiar with Bobby Fischer's style of play, it's always interesting to watch him in the beginning of a game because he always develops his pieces so methodically. He usually tries to gain center control with his pieces, and then anytime he sort of sees any sort of weakness in his opponent, he just strikes, and he strikes hard, and it's very hard to counter that. So just keep that in mind as we kind of look at how Bobby Fischer develops all his pieces, and then as soon as he starts to see a small weakness, he just kind of jumps on that. But from here, Bobby Fischer continues with his development with castling on the king side, and Black obviously has to get his knight out of the way. He brings his knight to e7, not a bad move, developing his knight, also connecting both his knights here on c6 and e7. At the same time, he does want to keep this long dark diagonal available for his dark square bishop here on g7 to attack. Now Bobby Fischer brings his rook to e1. You always want to support your pawns as they move up the board with your rooks behind them, so that's exactly what he's doing. And now Black plays pawn to d6. Obviously he wants to add a little bit of support to his pawn here on c5 as it is weak. At the same time, he does want to allow his bishop here, his light squared bishop, to have a square if he ever does need to come here. Now Bobby Fischer here decides to play pawn to c3, getting ready to push forward with his pawn to d4. He already does have his knight here on f3. He does have a nice little defense for his king, so he really wants to start to control the center of the board here, especially with his pawns. Now Black does have two options. He can either bring his pawn to e5, try to attack. Now he has two attackers on this d4 square, but he does elect for his other move, and that is to castle on the king side. It's never a bad thing to get king side safety, although he did have another move to bring his pawn to e5 right away. Now from here, Bobby Fischer decided to go ahead and move forward with his plan with pawn to d4. Again, he does have this pawn on c3 defending, this queen here on d1, and also this knight here on f3, all defending this pawn on d4. Now Black decides to go ahead and start to exchange, so Bobby Fischer elects to continue to do that and takes with his pawn on d4. Now Black now starts to push up his pawn on d5, trying to attack in the center here, try to have some sort of control. And Bobby Fischer elects to decline this exchange and instead moves pawn to e5. And this is a brilliant move because it really puts a lot of pressure on these dark squares on the king side. This outpost on f6 is going to be a huge weakness for black. If white can ever exchange off this dark square bishop and get this key defender of this f6 square, then he can easily put a knight here on f6 as a great outpost, or if he wants to get another piece involved, he can always sit this here on f6. So this is a great move, especially since black was trying to control the dark squares. For Bobby Fischer to play this e5 move, it really puts a lot of pressure on black here. As most strong players do, they like to develop all their pieces, so black went ahead here and played bishop to d7, developing the rest of his minor pieces. Bobby Fischer continued to follow suit. He plays knight to c3, again getting all his pieces developed into the game, at the same time trying to get center control. You always want to develop your minor pieces in the early game towards the center, so they're not only in the action, but they're controlling the center, which is so important in the early game. Now from here, black decided to play his rook to c8. You always want to put your rooks on open files or semi-open files, meaning if there's no pawns or if there's one pawn on a file, you always want your rooks to go there. So this is a great move by black here, putting his rook on c8. This is exactly where he needs to be so that he can be active and be used as he was meant to be. Now Bobby Fischer went ahead and brought his bishop to f4. Again, he really wants to develop his last minor piece here, thinking about all the different places that he can bring it. He could have brought it somewhere else, but he does not want to block off his rook here on e1. Obviously, he would be blocking off his queen here on d2, and he doesn't want to extend it too far. There's no reason to bring it to h6 and lose it right away, and there's no reason to bring it right now to g5, so he went ahead and brought it to f4. Nice safe move developing, but at the same time getting all his minor pieces into the game so he can start to get his major pieces activated. It's always hard to look at a chess game, especially at a GM level with such great chess mind, and say one specific move lost a chess game, because I think it's a accumulation of a lot of different moves together. A lot of times it's just brilliance from one side. But the next move from black is definitely questionable. He plays knight to a5, and while this does open up the c file for his rook, I don't feel like this is a great move for this knight here on a5. It's kind of lessening his active piece that he had here on c6, so I thought was a fine square. Kind of analyzing it, it may have been better for him to bring his knight to f5. After he done this, after Bobby Fischer brings his rook to c1, obviously Bobby Fischer wants to bring his rook to an active file here on c, then black could even bring his pawn down to h5, trying to really hold down this square here on g4 if anyone wants to come to this g4 square to kick off this knight. This knight has a great outpost here on f5. This would be a fantastic move here. Obviously, black is now putting a lot of pressure on the king side, and Bobby Fischer is going to have to find some way to combat this. But in the game, this is not what was played. Instead of this active move of knight to f5, instead the knight came to a5, kind of going away from the action, but really trying to get some action on the queen side, and kind of forgetting about the king side right now. From here, Bobby Fischer won as we continued. He brought his rook to c1. Obviously, again, as we talked about, you want your rooks on open or semi-open files. And from here, black played pawn to b5. As we talked about before, with his plan of knight to a5, he does really want to expand on the queen side, so that's exactly what he's doing. And from here, Bobby Fischer plays pawn to b3. Obviously, he doesn't want black to just completely march up the board, so he's going to try to defend a little bit on the queen side. Now from here, black continues up the board with pawn to b4, attacking the knight here. And so the knight from Bobby Fischer is going to come to e2 here. Obviously just kind of a waiting move to see. He's obviously defending this pawn here on d4, but at the same time, obviously he wants to free up the c file for his rook, and at the same time kind of wait to see where he wants to put this knight here that's on e2. Black decides to continue with his bishop to b5, which I personally think is a great move. Bishop here on d7 isn't doing too much and is really starting to put a lot of pressure with his minor pieces. Obviously he's attacking and defending this square here on c4, but at the same time he's now attacking this knight here on e2. It's just being a lot more active than it was here on d7. At the same time, it does free up this queen in case he does want to come to this d7 square. Now from here, Bobby Fischer elects to play with queen to d2, and this does a few things. One, it attacks this pawn here on b4. It also gives a little support to this bishop on f4 anytime this bishop wants to come to h6 to try to exchange off these dark square bishop, which we said was good earlier in the game. At the same time, he's also defending this knight here on e2. So any player, especially a player like Bobby Fischer, is going to play a move with multiple reasoning behind it. And so this move of queen to d2 really does get his queen into the game for many different reasons. Now from here, Black decides to bring his knight back to c6, which is where it should have been the entire game. But it's there now. Also, it's supporting this pawn here on b4. As we talked about, this queen is attacking it, so obviously you want to have your pawns and your pieces protected at all time if they are being attacked. From here, Bobby Fischer plays pawn to g4, and this is kind of a turning point in the game here. Bobby Fischer kind of looks at the board. He sees all his pieces kind of uniformly connected and working together. And he really wants to know what he wants to do with this knight here on e2. It's not really going to go to c3. It can't come to d4. Obviously, it can't go where the king is. The only real option is for it to come to g3. Obviously, this pawn here being on g3 right away, he can't go there. So he decides to really take a stab at attacking the king's side. This obviously does open up a little weakness. Obviously, anytime you expand your pawns in front of your king does get a little weaker, but he does have plans of bringing his knight to g3. Now, in my opinion, Black really only had one move here, although this is not what he moved. I think that he has to play bishop takes on e2, just kind of looking at what Bobby Fischer's plan is. Obviously, you never want Bobby Fischer to overload all his pieces on one side, because with his creativity, it's just not going to go good for you. Now, later, Panno was asked why he didn't exchange this, and he said that he didn't want to give Bobby Fischer the bishop pair after he exchanged his bishop for a knight. If you look at this game, though, it is somewhat closed in the middle, so I don't really think the bishop pair is as strong as his advantage. Yes, you don't want to give Bobby Fischer a bishop pair, but in a closed game, it's not as bad. In this case, I do think, though, that Black had to play bishop takes on e2, but he didn't. Instead, he played pawn to a5, solidifying the defense on this b4 pawn, and at the same time allowing this knight here on c6, which is the key defender of the pawn on b4, to move around the board. So now he can get this other knight involved into the game. Now, obviously, Bobby Fischer is going to continue his plan as fast as possible. His knight's not going to do anything unless he gets it over to this g3 square, as we talked about. There's nowhere else for it to go. So Bobby Fischer immediately plays knight to g3. Black not completely acknowledging, or I guess respecting, the attack that Bobby Fischer is about to just unleash on the chessboard. Black continues to try to expand on the queen side by bringing his queen to b6. If you can look at it, there's not a lot of great attacking lines that Black has for the queen side. So it is questionable, why he did try to attack on the queen side when there's not many options, and at the same time you see Bobby Fischer start to materialize and attack on the king side. But for what it's worth, queen was played to b6, and Bobby Fischer just decided that he's going all out and he's going to take this black king here on g8. So he plays pawn to h4, just completely marching up the board. He realizes it's going to be really hard for his king to be attacked, even though he is pushing these pawns up, because most of the powerful pieces for black are on the queen side. So he realizes that he can kind of overload the king side and dominate and checkmate the black king here. So Black now kind of got the idea that, hey, I should probably start to maneuver my pieces back over to the king side, and he plays knight to b8. At the same time, he's opening up the c file for his rook, but he also wants to kind of maneuver his knight over to d7 so he can, keep an eye on the f6 outpost that we talked about, which is a very critical square. And at the same time, if he ever needs to get his knight to the f8 square to protect this h7 square that will be a huge weakness later on in the game. From here, Bobby Fischer continued with his plan. Obviously, right now, he's trying to trade off the dark square bishops. As we talked about, once this dark square bishop is off the board, then this f6 square becomes a huge focal point as an outpost that Bobby Fischer can put one of his pieces, most notably a knight here on f6. So Black decided to bring his knight to d7, as we talked about before. No reason right away to exchange pieces. Instead, he really wants to try to get his knight involved into the game, attacking this f6 square. From here, Bobby Fischer played queen to g5, just continuing to put the pressure on Black here. He still has the same concepts in the back of his mind, but at the same time now, he's now pinning this pawn and the bishop down to the king. So if he starts to put his pawns up farther, he's still defending this bishop here on h6, but he's just slowly putting more and more pressure on Black. Black now decided to start to exchange pieces off. Anytime you start to feel a lot of pressure, it's usually good to exchange pieces off to kind of give you some breathing room. So Black does exactly that. He exchanges on c1 after the rooks come off the board. He now takes the bishop here on h6, and the queen comes here, and then the rook comes to c8, and both the rooks come off the board. And now Bobby Fischer just continues relentlessly moving his pawns up the board with pawn to h5, really putting a lot of pressure on the king side from Black. Now, Black now played queen to d8. He probably should have brought, his knight to f8 here. Again, I don't think he realizes just how big of a weakness this pawn here on h7. Anytime Bobby Fischer can bring his knight to g5, putting a lot of pressure on the pawn on h7. But in any case, he did bring his queen to d8. He really wants to get his queen involved in the game. As you can see, kind of Black's plan was kind of to attack on the queen side. He started to use all his moves and his development to bring to the queen side. And then when he realized, oh crap, Bobby Fischer is attacking my king side, then he said, well, let me just kind of backtrack and start to defend on the king side. So for what it's worth, White now played knight to g5, as we talked about before, putting a lot of pressure on this pawn on h7. And now Black plays knight to f8, trying to defend this checkmate here of queen to h7. Obviously, it wouldn't have been checkmate if this, the king could come to f8, but Bobby Fischer is threatening a mate pretty soon here. From here, Bobby Fischer has a fantastic move, and it's a bishop to e4. And the way this is great is because he obviously wants to get his light square bishop into the game, but at the same time, Black cannot really take with his pawn here on e4, because after the knight comes to e4, the knight's going to come to f6, and this is going to be really hard for Black to defend. Obviously, yes, Bobby Fischer is sacrificing a bishop here, but after his knight comes to f6, and there's no way for Black to stop this, it's pretty much going to be game over. So Black knows that he can't take on e4, so he decides to bring his queen to e7, really trying to get his queen involved in the game, try to protect the house, but it's just not going to work. From here, Bobby Fischer plays knight takes on h7, and after the knight comes and takes on h7, again, he is just sacrificing pieces because he understands the threat that he has, and even though he is giving up pieces, he realizes that this bishop here on b5 isn't doing anything. And it's not always how many pieces you have, it's how many active pieces you have attacking your opponent's king. So always remember that. Bobby Fischer obviously knows that. So he now takes on g6, and after the pawn takes on g6, now the bishop is going to take on g6. You can already see there's no fortress in front of the Black king here on g8, and Bobby Fischer is just going to continue up the board until he checkmates the Black. From here, Black plays knight to g5, kind of as a last-ditch effort, trying to start to attack on the king side. Bobby Fischer, doesn't really matter for him. He brings his knight to h5. He realizes the attack from Black can't really do much besides a few attacks here and there, and he realizes his attack is completely strong on this Black king on g8. So from here, the Black knight comes to f3, just trying to harass the White king. It's kind of out of hope here, but decides to try to attack anyway. The king's going to come up the board. Knight's going to come to h4, try to check the king again, and the king's just going to come up the board. Obviously, the knight now is going to take on g6, and this is kind of where Bobby Fischer shows his brilliance. He realizes a lot of people from here would take with the queen on g6. You know, the queen could come over now to you know, g7. That's kind of what people think what would happen. Instead, the king could now come to f8, and then you're trying to figure out, you know, what you want to do here. Instead, Bobby Fischer doesn't do what you expect. Instead, he plays knight to f6. And this is a fantastic move because the queen can't take because the pawn's supporting it. So what does the king do? The knight's pretty much a goner. So the king really doesn't have many options. His only move here is his king to f7. And from here, Bobby Fischer plays queen to h7, and from here, black resign. He really only has one option here. He can move his, you know, his king to f8. He can't move it to e8 or, you know, g8 because the queen and the rook, or excuse me, the queen and the knight here. And from here, Bobby Fischer can play queen to g8, checkmate. So Bobby Fischer never really looks for the obvious moves. He looks for the best move, which is what I always appreciated studying Bobby Fischer games. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this game. Many of you probably haven't seen this game before, so it was probably a treat for some of you. For those of you who have seen it, you're probably a super chess avid fan, which is fantastic. Hopefully you guys did enjoy the video and learn something. If you haven't checked out the website, thechesswebsite.com, and I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.